All right, YouTube, I wanted to talk about a topic that I haven't covered before. It goes into sort of new territory for me. Uh, and I'm just lounging here for no reason before anyone gets shocked that I'm not standing or sitting in front of the camera. The ethics of de-extinction from an occult perspective. The idea being science now is moving into an era of genetic study and medical study and anatomical study, and paleontology is advancing as well. You might as well throw that in because that's the actual root of the ability to bring an animal forth out of extinction. We are now moving into an age where it has become more than science fiction. Here's something that I wanted to point out first, though. Science fiction most often seems to become science fact later on. Even the idea of space elevators are first found in science fiction. You look at books like Wrinkle in Time or any of this stuff. Jurassic Park is a great idea. They genetically revive dinosaurs. Well, we may not be at the level where we can revive a Tyrannosaurus Rex at the moment, but they're saying that there is a very real possibility that we can revive things like the saber-toothed tiger, the woolly mammoth, the mastodon, even hominids. Early man could potentially be raised back from the dead, taken back from extinction. Animals that haven't been around for many tens or hundreds of thousands of years, possibly millions of years, things like giant sloths. All of these different creatures can potentially now, because of genetic advances, be taken out of extinction. I think people really haven't kept up with science if they don't realize this is fact. When I was a child, when I was younger, it was looked at as something that was interesting, as something that science was dabbling with, theorizing about, saying, well, can we do it? Is it theoretically possible to find enough undamaged DNA to do this? They now know, yes, it's possible. It's not only possible, they're actually starting the testing now. They are actively trying to revive the woolly mammoth. When that happens, it will be a breakthrough for the human species, the likes of which you haven't seen since we first split the atom. Hopefully with less drastic results, but I wanted to talk about the ethics of de-extinction, the ethical problems associated with bringing an animal out of extinction when it had gone extinct, presumably because of natural processes. I would say first, morally, the act itself, from my own opinion and perspective, the moral outlook on the actual act, taken out of all context, the act alone, is positive. I would say that because nature can play favorites and can be unfair, there is no specific reason to say that just because bringing it out of extinction is unnatural constitutes an immoral event. So I would say largely I support the idea of bringing things like mammoths and saber-toothed tigers out of extinction. However, there are caveats. There are things that I think that science needs to understand. We need to put some sense of ethics back in science, or we're going to unleash hell upon this earth. And I'd say that not in a cool occult way of, yeah, well, Satan will come out of a hole in the ground and rape us all. Something funny like that. I'm talking about literally degrading the planet and potentially destroying it through our own power, especially if we transfer all of these abilities over to humans and start genetically manipulating everyone as soon as they're conceived. The first idea that I have is that if an animal is revived from extinction, two things should be true. First, it should never, under any circumstances, be revived as a solo organism. It should always be among similar organisms, preferably not clones, not having 5 or 6 copies of the same animal, but several members of the same species derived from several different samples, if it is at all possible to do so. If it's not, I would say leave the animal alone until you can get those samples. And in the case of something like mammoths, we have thousands of mammoths frozen into the permafrost that are thawing out right now because of climate change. So there's no shortage of potential DNA samples. We can even analyze what these animals ate before they froze to death because they're so well preserved. So there's no shortage. There's no logical reason we can't do that. the reasoning behind this would be, how would you feel if the human race were to go extinct and you were revived by aliens or something, and you were the only member of your species? You would have nobody that you're able to fully communicate with. You might be able to imprint some feelings on them, but even if it's a closely related species, like bringing back a woolly mammoth and having elephant parents for it, and let's face it, we're killing off all the elephants too, which is hilariously sad in a strange, ironic twist of fate that we're talking about bringing the mammoth and the mastodon back when our own elephants are dying off by the thousands every year, or the hundreds anyway, in the illegal ivory trade. No, it shouldn't simply be a closely related species, but that is the second point. Not only should it have other members of its own species with it, it should also have, as closely matched as possible, an organism at least moderately similar to it in its physical features, presumably in its behavior and its tendencies, not only so that when you're studying it you're not getting as much bias as if you had some, other species rearing it, because then you're going to get some crossover of behavioral traits, but also just ethically. This organism, if it's at all intelligent, needs something that's similar to it that it can imprint on. It's like when people raise certain types of animals in captivity. If they're not imprinted upon the correct species, then if they're ever released in the wild, they'll die. They have to be held in captivity their entire life. You know why the caged bird sings, so forth. It's rather sad. I've always thought that that was a huge ethical problem. Even the idea of keeping pets, if they're a single pet, in some cases with some species, they can get bored. They can get depressed. They can start harming themselves out of depression and boredom if they're kept in a confined area with nothing to play with. I think that that is a root and fundamental value of all intelligent life forms. The ability to communicate should not be infringed upon. That should be considered a right for any animal that we bring back from extinction. Secondly, it might be worthwhile holding off on exercising our power to do this until we can study more. In some, with woolly mammoths and so forth, this isn't a problem, but with some of these other species that we don't have as many samples of, we don't necessarily know what they eat. Well, what's the point of bringing an animal back if you don't even know that there's anything on this earth it's capable of consuming and enjoying? What's the point? We know that woolly mammoths ate pine cones and berries and certain roots and green barks and so forth, and leaves. Well, we know that that's what woolly mammoths eat because we found it in their stomach. Some of those species that they were eating are still around today, some of the conifers and so forth. So there's no problem there, but do we know what some of these other species ate? If we brought back a dinosaur, would we know necessarily what it ate other than potentially other dinosaurs? Or plants that have been extinct for 100 million years? No, we wouldn't know that at all. So that's another thing. Literally, the diet is one of the most important things to consider. Another would be disease. Are there diseases now, here upon this earth, today, that could potentially weaken, cripple, or kill these animals? If so, do you want to bring them into that environment? You would have to keep them in a sterile lab condition for an extended period of time until you can potentially test these things. I think that the ethics of bringing back a species and then having to conduct a bunch of medical tests is also dubious. I think that we need to study more. I think that with more advances being made on the concept of junk DNA and finding that some of it comes from being infected with viruses, I would like to believe that it's possible to determine the types of viruses that might have attacked these different animals and inserted viral particles into their DNA. I would like to think that that's possible to do. Given enough time and genetic advances, I believe that will be the case. It might be worth holding off, at least on some of these species, in doing so until that is the case. Another thing that needs to be considered is profit motive. If these techniques become popularized and are privatized, or even if they're not, even if it's just governments and universities doing this, who's to say, who's going to create a regulatory structure to make sure that these animals aren't being abused? I would think that if a corporation or a university in some country where there's a lot of corruption learned how to bring woolly mammoths back, they might bring a whole bunch of them back and start using them for, blood fights in an arena or something. or selling or butchering them and selling their meat, literally just to try to make a profit off a species that man can really ethically lay no claim on because they weren't even necessarily around when we were. Some of these species predate even archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals that would have had the capability of understanding the idea of ethics. Some of them date back further than the archaic period, especially if with new advances we somehow gain the capability of making dinosaurs. I would say that's a far step, 100 million years removed in some cases, or more if you're going back to the Jurassic or Triassic period, from, the more modern period of mammals, essentially, megafauna, as well as minor fauna. I would say with things like plants, though, I would say there are no ethical problems. There might be a problem with destroying ecosystems by bringing back something that turns out to be quite virulent, maybe highly toxic with no natural predators and then suddenly takes over. With plants, I would say there's no ethical quandaries. Because plants don't feel, they don't have a brain. They're not capable of feeling pain. Therefore, things like plants, you could make an argument for certain insect life as well. No, I think they should bring that back as soon as they're able, as long as they do it under controlled conditions and they do extensive testing to make sure that none of these creatures become invasive. We've got enough invasive species that are already extant on this planet right now. We don't need to bring back some cycad from the Triassic period, only to find that it does really well and has a tendency to outcompete every other species in its niche. I would say the same about more modern plants. We could literally cultivate potentially seeds, actual seed tissues, or make clones of, or something else, or manipulate the DNA of some of these plants from even the woolly mammoth stomachs. Some of these conifers, the berries and so forth. We know that a lot of those species are still around today, but if we find one that's not, it could become invasive. There's a type of river rat or something that lives in Siberia. And they've been finding seeds that are slowly thawing out in these are nests from thousands of years ago. They're thawing out. And so in digging through these, they've found various seeds. They've found precursors to ancestors of modern species. And they've cultivated them. There was a date seed that they found in Israel that dates back to like 5,000 years old, and they managed to get it to grow by soaking it in fertilizer water first, to restore its germ tissue, and it grew. They've found seeds for ancient, I believe it was papyrus, in some of the tombs in Egypt. They got it to grow. It's several thousand years old. It turns out that it's not anything like modern papyrus. It's far shorter and broader. It's almost a subspecies, even though it's genetically basically the forerunner of modern papyrus. With these plants, there's always the danger that they become invasive, or that they're highly toxic to an endangered animal that already exists on this planet. And I think there's another thing with the ethics of de-extinction. Is it ethical to be putting a great deal of time, money, and effort into literally raising the dead, almost a form of scientific necromancy, if you will? Is it ethical to do that? Is it morally upright to do so when we are destroying our own creatures? And in which it is clear, as humans operate today, many people around the world, many cultures, many countries, and people even within countries and cultures that don't necessarily smile upon this, they seek only profit and to fill their bellies when it comes to other living organisms. They have little or no regard to the suffering of animals. They have no regard to the suffering of plants, although, again, ethically, that's not clear that you need to. Is it moral to be bringing back creatures from the dead when we're driving others into the grave as we speak? Elephants, rhinoceros, tigers, lions, all of the cheetahs are now critically endangered. Various plants that are endangered, some of these species that might inhabit only a few acres of land out in the rainforest in an area that's slated to be logged off. We're destroying species quite quickly. Man, you can argue, I would debate over climate change. But the idea of humans polluting the world and overdeveloping it and driving species to extinction and poaching them to extinction and even eating them to extinction not only is a modern problem, it appears to have been a problem in ancient times as well. It appears now likely that humans caused the extinction of some of these megafauna, especially the herbivores, from the period of early mankind. Because, I mean, they're herbivores. They're easy to hunt. They're not going to try to eat you. The giant sloth, it's slowly lumbering around. It's got no real natural defensive mechanism other than it's big, and predators tend not to go after it. But man was smart enough to know he could make a spear and just hurl it into its skull. So that is the nature of man. I think that there are ethical problems that we need to work through within science and within philosophy itself before we should be jumping into bringing things back from the dead, unless they are plants and unless they are properly researched already, and we either know or presume that they are not going to become invasive. That I don't think anyone has a problem with, and that would be, I think, interesting as well. It would be cool to have extinct plants in my garden. I would love that. Would I want a woolly mammoth lumbering around in my yard? Probably not. And I think the other part is the inconvenience on humankind itself, potentially trying to care for creatures that may have voracious metabolisms, especially with dinosaurs inhabiting a world that was far warmer potentially and more lush than it is today in some regions. How do you feed them? How many cows a day are you going to have to feed your pet velociraptors, so to speak? I think that the movie Jurassic Park, ironically, gets it kind of right on some of the ethical dilemmas when they point out, some of the plants that they were using for decoration were poisonous, but they just picked them because they looked good, and they have no hope of controlling creatures that have been extinct that man's never interacted with before, because they don't fully understand them. All we are looking at are fossils and corpses frozen into the soil. So I think definitely, if something like a mammoth is brought back, it needs to be, at the very least, we need to study what diseases might affect it for moral reasons. We need to make sure it's brought back in a plural manner. It would be very sad if they bring back one lonely little baby woolly mammoth and it thinks that some elephant is its actual mother, even though it's a completely different species. And it spends the rest of its life in a cage being poked and prodded with needles. I think that would be morally reprehensible to do. I don't think that that's proper at all, and I think that if there really are aliens and they're looking down at us, right now they're probably smiling that we're making such breakthroughs. If we start doing that, I think they will very quickly start frowning, because an advanced race, I would like to believe, would have a higher ethical standard than that, simply beyond the utilitarian, because they would have potentially evolved beyond the idea of need into the idea of what is upright, what do we want to do now, for our research purposes. That doesn't involve, probably doesn't involve anal probes. Unless you happen to be taking PCP, then it apparently becomes quite common. You could call it the alien drug. But yes, these are my thoughts on de-extinction. Just totally off the wall topic. I bet people didn't expect me to bother covering something like this. I was going to do another occult video, but I got bored with it. I was going to talk about politics, but I got bored with that too, so I decided to launch into this. That's about all.